The Damsel of Death, the Highway Hooker, the Hooker from Hell, and simply Monster. These are some of the names given to Aileen Wuornos, America's first female serial killer. Tonight, we're revisiting the story of one of the most famous serial killers of the 20th century. And even though she was put to death by the state of Florida in 2002, she's about to get a new life on the small screen. Hi, I'm Katie Ring, and welcome to Night Watch. If you're into true crime, real-time courtroom drama, and late-night deep dives, you're in the right place. Subscribe to my YouTube channel or follow me on Spotify. We have new episodes out every weeknight.
Aileen Wuornos was a prostitute in Florida who robbed and killed 7 of her male clients in a 12-month span, from November of 1989 to November of 1990.
That's a hell of a lot of men I went through before the next jerk came along and I used protection.
Lee Wuornos murdered them, robbed them, and then drove home in their cars.
This episode discusses active criminal cases and breaking news. The information we share is based on what's publicly available at the time of recording and may change as new evidence comes to light. We aim to inform, not to decide guilt or innocence. So everyone mentioned is presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. It's entirely possible you've already heard of the main character for tonight's story. You may have read her autobiography, Dear Dawn, or you may have seen an Oscar-winning portrayal of her in the movie Monster, where she's played by a virtually unrecognizable Charlize Theron. But earlier this month, it was announced that Emmy Award-winning actress Sarah Paulson will once again join forces with her longtime collaborator, Ryan Murphy, to play serial killer Aileen Wuornos in season 4 of the hit Netflix series Monster. It says something that Eileen's story still captures our imaginations and speaks to our darkest fears a quarter century after she was put to death. It's a story that only needs to be heard to understand why Hollywood keeps coming back to her tragic life. That life began in Rochester, Michigan in 1956, and right from the beginning, it wasn't easy. Eileen's mother, Diane, and her father got married when Diane was only 14 years old and her dad, Leo, was 18. They had her older brother, Keith, and when she was only 16, she gave birth to her second kid, a baby girl named Aileen. Overwhelmed by the pressures of being a teenage parent, Diane abandoned her kids when Aileen was only 6 months old, and Aileen and her brother, Keith, were left in the care of their abusive grandfather, Lowry, and their alcoholic grandmother, Britta. Eileen's father, Leo Pittman, wasn't really in the picture, which in this case was definitely a good thing because he was a convicted who ended up dying in prison while serving time for kidnapping and assaulting a 7-year-old girl. Although it was good her father wasn't in her life, unfortunately her grandparents weren't much better. Lowry was extremely physically abusive, and Aileen would later say that he would regularly essay her as well. We say allegations because these were never proven in court, and because Aileen is a notoriously unreliable narrator of her own life. Her stories on her upbringing, and especially her later crimes, changed constantly throughout her life, her trial, and her eventual incarceration, right up to the moment of her death. That said, I definitely think it is more likely than not given his behavior. But one detail that remains constant is this. One rainy night in 1969, when Aileen was 13, a car pulled up alongside her. The driver said he knew her grandfather and offered her a ride. Whether or not he really did know Lowry, we'll probably never know. But what we do know is that Aileen was essayed, became pregnant, and once she couldn't conceal the pregnancy any longer, she was shamed by her family for being promiscuous. The audacity to judge the 15-year-old you are allegedly essaying for getting pregnant is wild to me. But this mindset is very in line with the way abusers think. Aileen was shipped to a home for unwed mothers in Detroit, where she spent an entire day laboring, giving birth to her son in 1971. The child was eventually given up for adoption, and to this day, very little is known about him. Things didn't get any easier for the young Eileen after that. Shortly after giving birth, her grandma died of liver failure and her grandfather kicked her out of the house, so she became a ward of the state. The last few years of her childhood were marked by numerous attempts to run away, and she survived in the only ways she knew how: hitchhiking, adult S work, if you know what I mean, stealing, sleeping in abandoned cars, and in the woods. This was the life she'd return to again and again. Over the next few years, her grandfather died, and then in 1976, Eileen's older brother Keith lost his battle with cancer at just 21 years old. Eileen ended up getting a $10,000 life insurance payout, which she quickly used to buy a car, which she also totaled soon after buying. With nothing keeping her in the cold Midwest, Eileen set out for the Sunshine State. She hitchhiked to Florida, supporting herself through S work. As an aside, I think most people know this by now, but please never hitchhike. It is one of the most dangerous things you can do. The FBI even has a classification for murders along the highway serial killings. They've estimated that 400 to 500 long haul drivers are responsible for about 850 murders along the highway. But Eileen made it safely all the way to Florida. She bounced around for a bit and ended up dating a 69-year-old yacht club president named Louis Fell. They met sometime in 1976, and despite their 50-year age difference, they got married that May. But the relationship didn't last long. Only 2 months later, in July, Louis divorced Eileen due to her, quote, violent and ungovernable temper. Allegedly, Eileen beat Louis with his own cane. After the divorce, Eileen was back on the streets to fend for herself. Although Eileen had committed many petty thefts over the years, she had her biggest run in with the law in May 1981. She walked into a convenience store in Edgewater, pulled a gun, and robbed the clerk. And all she got was $35, 2 packs of cigarettes, an armed robbery conviction, and 3 years in prison. She actually only served a little over 18 months and was released in June of 1983. And here's where the spiral picks up speed. Because Eileen didn't walk out of prison reformed. She walked out angrier, harder, more reckless, and aimless than ever. From 1984 to 1989, the years right before the murders, Eileen had a steady, almost relentless stream of run ins with the law. The official record reads like a storm you can't stop watching. In 1984, she was arrested for attempting to pass forged checks. A year later, she was questioned for holding a gun in a car, but was released without charges. In 1986, she was arrested in Miami for car theft, resisting arrest, and obstruction when she tried to give false identification. The next year, she was involved in multiple bar fights and accused of assault. No major charges stuck, but police knew her name by now. In 1988, she was accused by a man of pulling a gun on him and demanding money. She claimed self-defense. Case dropped. The next year, another accusation, this time threatening a man with a beer bottle. Again, charges didn't stick. One officer would later describe Eileen as a fuse that was always sizzling. She was definitely headed down a dark path. But then, when Eileen was 30, she walked into a gay bar called Zodiac Bar, and there she met the person she would call the love of her life, a 24-year-old woman named Tyra Moore. In 1986, Eileen and Tyra settled in Daytona Beach. The two moved from motel to motel, living off Eileen's earnings from the S work and whatever odd jobs Ty could pick up. But money was always tight, and Eileen felt pressure to provide, to support their life together, to keep Ty from leaving. Eileen was also often in dangerous situations as an S worker, so she started carrying a stolen .22 caliber handgun for protection. Eileen suffered a horrendous childhood. She had been abused, abandoned, assaulted, and exploited her entire life. But one fateful day, at the end of November 1989, Eileen made a pivotal decision, one that would take her from someone who had a rough upbringing to a full-blown serial killer. When it comes to the holidays, sometimes it seems like the easiest option would be to just buy someone a gift card and call it a day. But if you're like me and really want to do something special, then skip the headache this year and gift an Aura frame. I've always loved the idea of a digital frame because I have so many pictures I love and can never choose which ones I want to frame, but I never really loved the way they looked. But my sister, who is an interior designer, bought our whole family Aura frames last year. She got us a Carver frame in white, and it's the perfect blend of functionality and aesthetics. I just became an auntie, so it's also so fun seeing pictures of my niece and nephew pop up on the frame from our shared family album. For a limited time, save on the perfect gift by visiting auraframes.com to get $35 off Aura's best-selling Carver matte frames, named #1 by Wirecutter, by using promo code CRIMEHOUSE at checkout. That's AURA frames.com, promo code CRIMEHOUSE. This deal is exclusive to listeners and frames sell out fast, so order yours now to get it in time for the holidays. Support the show by mentioning us at checkout. Terms and conditions apply. On November 30th, 1989, Aileen Wuornos was looking to pick up clients along the side of the road when she picked up Richard Mallory, a 51-year-old local and small business owner. According to Eileen, she and Richard spent the next several hours drinking and smoking pot before they drove into the woods for some privacy. And that's where the story gets hazy. Eileen has told different versions of what happened. In one version, she and Richard argued about the kind of sex they would have. Things got heated, and Eileen thought Richard was going to hurt her. In another version of the story, Richard didn't just scare her. He actually bound, SA'd her, and tortured her before threatening to kill her. Apparently, Richard said he'd killed women before, too. So Eileen fought for her life and eventually got herself free. Although what exactly happened up until this point was debated, what happened next was undeniable. Eileen pulled out her pistol and shot Richard in the chest, but Richard was still alive, and he tried to climb out of the car, so Eileen shot him again. And here's where the question of whether Richard really threatened her or not comes into question. Because once Eileen was sure he was dead, she rifled through his pockets, wiped the car down with Windex, and wrapped Richard's body in a rug she found in the woods. Afterward, she drove his car to a busy beachside parking lot and left it there. Then Eileen went home to Tyra. She was extremely drunk, and according to Tyra, she admitted to killing someone. Tyra didn't want to believe her and told Eileen to stop talking about it. But even though Tyra was acting like she was okay, when Eileen sobered up, she was terrified that Tyra would leave her. So she tried to take it back and said that she just stumbled onto the body in the woods. But it only makes things worse. After that, Eileen knew something had changed between them, and she decided there was no going back. On May 19th, 1990, 43-year-old David Spears spotted Eileen on the side of the road and pulled over to offer her a lift. Just like before, we only have Eileen's testimony on what happened next, and her account was inconsistent. In some versions, David tried to attack her with a lead pipe after he realized she was a S worker. But regardless of what instigated the violence, the result was the same. Eileen shot David 6 times in the chest, stripped him naked, and left his body on the ground for police to find 2 weeks later. After this, Eileen's crimes gained a lot of momentum. Later that same month, on May 31st, Charles Kerskaden pulled over on the side of the highway where Eileen was pretending to have car trouble. Their encounter resulted in him being shot 9 times in the chest and stomach. Eileen then stole some valuables from his car, disposed of his body in an unknown location, then burned the car. And here's where her motives start to really come into question again. In a lot of Eileen's stories about her murder, she painted herself as a victim and said that most of these men tried to SA her. But other accounts say that she rarely was upfront. Instead, she dressed like a down on her luck hitchhiker who was just looking for a ride. Once she got picked up, Eileen would make up a story about needing money for some reason or another, maybe to help support a daughter that she didn't really have. She'd then offer to trade a sexual favor for money before killing her victim. So while it's certainly possible that Eileen really was assaulted and was simply defending herself, she did act in a very calculated manner. And regardless of what led to her killing these men, she did rob them after. Although, while she could have thought that S work was the best way for her to make money, she also didn't express a lot of reservations about doing it. And on June 7th, 1990, a retiree named Peter Seams encountered Eileen near the Georgia Florida border. His body still hasn't been found to this day. On July 30th of that same year, 50-year-old truck driver Troy Burris comes across Eileen along his delivery route. She convinced him to pull over into the woods while driving through the Ocala National Forest. His body was later found partially undressed with 2 gunshot wounds to the torso. And then, after a few quiet months, on September 11th, 1990, Eileen crossed paths with Dick Humphreys, a former police chief and Air Force major. Ironically, on the day of his death, he was midway through a career as a social worker investigating child abuse. Eileen hasn't spoken as much about Humphreys as her other victims, but his status as a former cop meant that right from the jump, a lot of eyes were on the case. His cause of death is one that should sound familiar by now: multiple 22 caliber gunshot wounds to the torso. And as police agencies across Florida started to compare notes, they realized the murder fit a pattern. Before long, investigators were looking at 5 men who had all been shot, robbed, and left in the woods. And as this pattern emerged, so did a horrifying realization: they were dealing with a serial killer. However, investigators treated Peter Seams as a missing persons case because they never found his body. But they did find his car. For whatever reason, Eileen had kept it after murdering him. And on July 4th, 1990, she was riding in the passenger seat while Tyra was driving. All of a sudden, Tyra lost control of the car and crashed it into a gate on the side of the road. Eileen immediately realized they had to flee, so she pulled Tyra out of the car. The 2 women continued on foot. However, witnesses to the crash called 911. When the police showed up, they quickly realized the car belonged to a man who had been missing for almost a month. Not long after, investigators looking into the roadside murders connected Peter Seams' disappearance to the 5 other homicides. They also realized that the 2 women that witnesses saw leaving the wreck must have been involved in those deaths. By this point, the walls were closing in on Eileen, but she still had one life left to claim: a 60-year-old security guard named Walter Antonio. On November 19th, 1990, Antonio ran into Eileen while she was extremely intoxicated. According to Eileen, Antonio pressured her to have sex with him for free. They started arguing, and Eileen shot Antonio. But she was too drunk to notice if he was already dead when she stole his valuables and drove away. By the end of November 1990, witnesses who had seen Eileen and Tyra at the crash site saw their composite sketches all over the news. Realizing the danger, Eileen put her girlfriend on a bus out of town at the beginning of December. Once again, alone and heartbroken, Eileen started drinking heavily as her world closed in around her. Meanwhile, she had no idea that the police had more than her sketch to go on. Thousands of tips were called in by people who thought they recognized her. The most promising lead came from someone at a pawn shop, where someone matching the description had sold a radar detector belonging to Eileen's first victim, Richard Mallory. Her name came up in the shop's registry as Cammie Green, which didn't come up in any databases. But there were other ways to find her. Because in Florida and many other states, pawn shops require sellers to leave a fingerprint on file, and that print matched someone in the criminal database. It turned out Cammie Green was actually Aileen Wuornos, and when the police eventually compared it to the handprint on Peter Seam's car, it was a match for her too. It was only a matter of time until the authorities tracked her down. Early in the morning on January 9th, 1991, police arrested Aileen Wuornos as she was leaving a local bar called The Last Resort. Aileen Wuornos' killing spree officially ended, but at the same time, her story was only just beginning. Aileen Wuornos was arrested in 1991 for a total of 7 murders. As Eileen prepared to stand trial in Florida, the story of her crimes turned her into one of the most feared and vilified people in the country. A lot of outlets labeled her as the first female serial killer in modern times. Even though that wasn't true, it stuck. And when the trial got underway, both tabloids and news outlets became fascinated by Eileen's story. Her narrative turned traditional ideas about S workers completely upside down. People already knew that S workers were extremely vulnerable, but Eileen wasn't a victim. She was the one to be feared. By the time she stepped into the courtroom, she was both hated and feared by many. Other people, however, saw a more sympathetic figure. They looked at Eileen and saw a woman who had been dealt an awful hand, a life that kicked her while she was down, again and again. They saw someone who was driven to violence out of desperation, and someone who had been betrayed by every single person in their life, including the woman she believed was the love of her life, because Tyra was the person who got her in the end. She cooperated with the police to get a recording of Eileen confessing to all of the murders. In the end, the jury determined she was in fact a serial killer, and after debating for only an hour and a half, they returned a verdict on January 7th, 1992. Aileen Wuornos was guilty of 6 counts of murder, and she received the death penalty for every single count. Eileen filed multiple appeals, but for all intents and purposes, her legal story ended there. However, her place in our collective cultural imagination had only just started to take root. In November 1992, the made-for-TV movie Overkill, The Aileen Wuornos Story, debuted on CBS. None other than future 7-time Emmy Award winner Jean Smart played the down-on-her-luck serial killer. At this point, less than 2 years had passed since authorities caught Eileen, and already pop culture grappled with the sticky question: did something turn Eileen into a killer, or was she born that way? But her biggest moment in the cultural spotlight came in 2003, when the director Patty Jenkins' feature film adaptation Monster hit the big screen. The movie stars an almost unrecognizable Charlize Theron as Wuornos in complex facial prosthetics and false teeth, and a young Christina Ricci plays a fictionalized version of her lover, Tyra Moore. The film was a hit, and Theron's performance as Eileen was universally praised. She won the Oscar that year for Best Actress. Her acceptance speech thanked her director, her mother, and didn't mention the actual Eileen once, which says a lot about where people generally landed in terms of their perception of her. Eileen's story clearly continued to fascinate people, and recently we learned that another decorated actress would take on the role of the woman branded as America's first female serial killer. When the hit Netflix series Monster unveiled its 4th season, the creative team announced they would focus this miniseries on notorious axe murderer Lizzie Borden. Creator Ryan Murphy and company turned to their first woman main character after tackling infamous killers like Jeffrey Dahmer, Ed Gein, and the Menendez brothers. Borden, who will be played by Ella Beatty, will be joined on screen by a number of other famous female killers throughout recent history, including a performance by Emmy Award-winning actress Sarah Paulson as none other than Aileen Wuornos. This isn't Murphy's first time putting Wuornos on screen either. Another frequent collaborator, Lily Rabe, played the serial killer in American Horror Story during a season 5 cameo. Our collective fascination with Eileen's story isn't limited to movies or television, though. Just last month, in November of 2025, an auction of her effects, including a pair of flip-flops and a crucifix necklace she wore to her execution, fetched prices as high as $12,000. As of this writing, you can still buy a bandana she wore in prison for $2,500. As of now, season 4 of Monster is currently in production in Los Angeles. We'll have to wait and see how this latest iteration of Aileen Wuornos shapes her story. But as for the real Eileen, her story is finished. She was executed in Florida on October 9th, 2002, after abandoning any efforts at an appeal and claiming she was ready to die. Mental health and victims' rights advocates have come forward both before her execution and after to argue that her trial and her sentence didn't take Eileen's whole life into consideration, and that perhaps mercy should have been shown to this woman who suffered so much. I'm curious to see if the Monster series will stay close to her actual life, so we'll keep you posted with any updates on the show's developments. What did you think of tonight's case? Drop your thoughts and theories in the comments. See you next time. If you haven't already, subscribe to our YouTube channel at Crime House Daily and follow us on social media at Crime House 24/7 for real-time updates, because the pursuit of justice never stops.